Hey reader, this is Centaur here, and today, since we've completed our looking at engineer units, infantry flamethrowers, things like that, as well as Goliaths, we have all the information that we need to talk about the engineer platoon in third edition. And we're going to talk about its strengths, its weaknesses, what it's useful for, how effective it is, why we may not be seeing very much of it here in third edition, and ways that I think it might be better. And so, like we did with artillery platoons, we're going to look at what scenarios might be more favorable to engineering platoons over and against others. We'll look at board considerations and what will make you excited when you see a board that you're playing on when you've decided to field these, as opposed to one that might make you feel like this is going to be an uphill battle. If not, maybe you've already lost before the game even starts. We're going to look at deployment considerations and how to maximize the platoon just based off of things like deployment. We're going to look at matchups and which ones might be better or worse for you if you're choosing to use engineers. We're going to look at what choices you should make, things that might be more effective for engineers over and against other choices within the unit. And we'll look at nation considerations because some nations are going to perform better than others when it comes to engineering platoons specifically. Not all nations are created equal. Okay. And then we'll look at some changes that I would recommend that you would make and why it matters. So to start off with, scenarios. If you're looking at a kill point mission, I'm going to put this as an iffy choice. It might be good for you because flamethrowers have a way to potentially be a one-shot removal item for an enemy squad. And it could be a one-shot removal tool for an enemy vehicle. So in that sense, since you're the only way you can get access to flamethrowers, and since you tend to have relatively good access to submachine guns, typically not as good as a paratrooper section, but for other stuff, you might have access to good submachine guns. And in the case of the Soviets, as you see over there on the side, you can get access potentially to body armor on your assault engineers. It means that you have a reasonable choice of potentially removing the enemy. Now, it means that you typically have to get within 6 to 12 inches of them in order to do damage. So if the enemy is built to shoot you down and mow you down before you get in there, you might find that you may not have the numbers left and you may not have the firepower left to actually remove very much of the enemy while coughing up an awful lot in the process. Whether those in the forms of transports that got destroyed, infantry sections that got destroyed, team weapons that got destroyed, you might be coughing up quite a bit by virtue of taking an engineering platoon. So toward that end, I'm going to say it's iffy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. For objective controlling, they're actually pretty good, both because engineers are the kinds of squad where you can park them on an objective and then just wait for the enemy to come to you. And you can just go down if you need to in cover in order to keep them safe and on the objective. And if they try to dig you out, they're coming closer to submachine guns and flamethrowers, both of which want to be really, really close. They're also obviously relatively decent at clearing enemies out of objectives because you can walk up to somebody who's on an objective, hose them down a little bit, and you might find that the objective is suddenly yours. For maneuver and positioning, I think this one's also really situational. It really all depends on what the kind of scenario is because, yeah, for something like sectors, it can work okay until the enemy realizes that they can simply maneuver around you, fall back a bit, and continue doing attriting fire to you until they're ready to actually take you. And getting to the enemy quarter might actually be relatively difficult with these guys on account of how many pins you might be taking, how many losses you might incur. And then you actually have to still stick around within the objective, right? A lot of engineering squads and obviously the team weapons are going to be limited to a relatively small number of bodies. And so because of that, staying power is a real question when it comes to these. If you need to be able to maneuver through, rough terrain in order to get to an objective, for scoring, or, maybe it's a breakthrough scenario where you got to just get into the enemy deployment zone or, off the enemy board edge, engineers are fine. They're not necessarily all that great. And there are other reasons why you might take other builds, like say a recce platoon or a rifle platoon over and against an engineering platoon. So, just from an effectiveness standpoint, it really depends. It really depends. Sometimes they're really good for this. Sometimes they're really not. It's your mileage is going to vary. In general, veteran crews tend to perform better than regular ones for the purpose of some of these scenarios. But obviously, from a kill point scenario, you don't gain anything extra for having a veteran squad other than the fact that their morale is higher, so they're more likely to pass an order test. They are less likely to cough up victory points, though, as veterans. So in general, I think if I'm looking at taking these, even though you can take them as regular crews for a lot of armies, I think you're going to find that your mileage is going to be better with veterans when it comes to engineers. For board consideration, you want heavy density boards. You want basically firing lanes of 12 inches or less. You want somebody to have gone crazy building a Stalingrad board. That's like the ideal scenario. Now, in my opinion, most boards shouldn't look like that. I think it's helpful at some events to have a few boards that are like that, where there are relatively tight quarters to play in. So that way we don't end up with just a gunline style meta ruling everything. But in general, you want this to be as dense and as tight as you can. Because again, if you're primarily relying on submachine guns, 12-inch range, and flamethrowers, 6-inch range, you don't want to be shot down by rifles, 24-inch range, light machine guns, 36-inch range, medium or heavy machine guns, Chevy even better range, and armored vehicles, let alone artillery, right? Which can have often upwards of 48-inch range. So, toward that end, denser is better. In general, you want hardcover deployment. So that way you can get protection from people before you activate. You also want lanes for advance. So, whether you are an engineering squad that starts in an armored vehicle, and it's taking advantage of, say, like a stone wall or hiding more than half of itself behind a building, you want to make sure that you have a means of being able to get up to the enemy. What you want is you want an effective means of movement. You can start in a ruin. Just know that it means that if you need to move up toward the enemy, you're going to be moving at 6 inches on that first advance, and you're going to be hoping that you're getting cover after that. And that doesn't give you a lot of options. So just make sure that you leave yourself that option for movement that will get you up to the enemy faster. You want lots of defenses, you want lots of buildings, you want lots of ruins and lots of forests, just so that way wherever you park yourself at the end of any move and wherever you end up ending your move right when you're shooting at the enemy, you have an opportunity for cover saves afterwards. Because as soon as the flamethrower goes off, if the enemy has a choice, he is going to shoot at that and he's going to try to remove it because you paid a lot of points for it and it can be quite dangerous. So the more chances that they have for removal, the better. And then in general, you want roads for potential transport enhancement. And this is why, as you'll see later when we look at choice options, you really want to be moving these things up in a wheeled vehicle or a half-track vehicle, depending on whether or not you want to have the freedom to be able to move through rough terrain. You want to make sure that you can move up swiftly and quickly. You don't want to be making your first attack on turn 4. You want to be making your first attack on turn 2 if you possibly can. Turn 3 is fine. It all depends on reasons for what's going on. But in general, you want to be attacking as quickly as possible with these short range units. From a deployment consideration, you need cover, okay? Because you have to get in close, and especially with how fragile two-man teams are now that there's no immediate -1 to hit penalty against them, you absolutely need to save your bodies for when you're in tight. Okay. And that means if the enemy gets the first draw on turn 1, you don't want them opening up with a bunch of long range weapons and hitting units that have no cover. Okay. So make sure that you have cover for your units while they're moving up. And even after they fire, you're going to want it even then. Okay. You want to deploy with 1 to 2 maneuver lane access. You want to make sure that you have not just one path that you can go on because the enemy can predict that. You want 1 to 2. So that way now, if they have assets, they got to stack assets in order to try to cancel you out, or they choose to guard 1 and you're able to move around another way, and that gives you an option for getting in closer without being immediately pinned or shot or removed in the process. You want to also plan your maneuver lanes to coincide with objectives. If this is an objective-based game, you want the lane that you're going after to also be an effective way to get to an objective. If the enemy stacks a bunch of stuff along a road that will lead directly to 1 or 2 objectives, and the only way around without incurring all the wrath of those units is to go really far to the side and out of the way, that can be a win for the enemy if that's the route you're taking, okay? So do be careful about this. There are ways to kind of trap these units because of the fact that engineers really excel at short-range fighting. And then finally, your transports are going to dictate what terrain you deploy in, right? So you can technically do a tracked vehicle. You can still do Brengineers if you want to. Just remember that a Bren carrier does not get double movement on roads, which means you're only going to be moving up 9 to 18 inches at a time. And if you want to jump out on the same turn, it's only going to be a max of 9, which is not a lot. Whereas a half-tracked or a wheeled vehicle moving up on a road could move up 18 to 24 inches and still drop you out, which is quite effective. So just realize that your transports are going to dictate how you're going to play. If you're leaning into wheeled vehicles, you're probably looking for open terrain or roads exclusively, right? Half-tracks, you have a lot of flexibility, and I think that's going to be the ideal carrier for a lot of engineering teams, because of the fact that you can move through rough terrain, you can move through open terrain, you can move through roads, you have a lot of freedom. Tracked vehicles can technically move through a lot of different kinds of terrain. You even get some amphibious style tracked vehicles, The problem, of course, with these is you're never getting that doubled movement, so you know that you're going to be moving slower. So, in terms of matchups, what's good for you? Armored armies, I think, are kind of an iffy choice, mostly because getting to the distance up there is going to be tricky. You have penetration issues now that you're down to a pen plus two, becomes pen plus three against the top armor. But that means that if they have a company commander nearby or a platoon commander nearby, you are not necessarily likely to do damage to the actual vehicle with a flamethrower. You might even run out of fuel, and then sure, they do have to take the morale check, very probably, unless it's one of those veteran heavy tanks, in which case I'm sorry, you're just in trouble with the flamethrowers. But even if they have to make a morale test, if they have a platoon commander or a company commander nearby, they might pass. In which case, you haven't done anything to them. So armored armies have a reasonable chance of removing you, while you might have some difficulties removing them. So I'm just going to call it iffy. If you end up hitting just a tankette swarm and they run up fast and they don't have sufficient morale bubble coverage, you might do okay against those. But against people who know how to run, an armor Death Star style build, your mileage may vary. Against other assault armies, this is also really iffy because if they can get to you and get into you before you can hose them down, you might find that unless you've invested in a whole lot of submachine guns in your engineer squad, you might find that you actually lose a bunch of those fights. And more than that, if they've been able to pin you an awful lot or winnow you down while you're moving up and then they assault you, they might remove you without suffering many casualties in the process. At which point, you'll find yourself out an awful lot of tools, and they will then begin maneuvering quickly towards your army without much to stop them. So I think it really all depends. Who can outmaneuver who is going to be the thing that's going to determine it between a flamethrower engineer heavy army versus an assault heavy army. If you're fighting another barbecue army, this is actually a really good choice. It really all depends on who gets the maneuver on it, but they're going to come to you. So I think you'll actually find you're more effective. And if you're running a bunch of these flamethrowers alongside really good armor that can kind of outgun and outperform them early on, they might have to come to you, in which case you might have more of a defensive benefit when preparing to hit them. So honestly, I think you're actually pretty good against a barbecue army as long as you can, show good generalship and really kind of play to you and make sure that the momentum runs in your favor. Against greatest hits and mixed bag armies, this one's really kind of up in the air. On the one hand, they got a lot of tools, filling a lot of roles, and that means they might be able to beat you if you're deciding to overpower the barbecue and flamethrower and submachine gun side of the game. On the other hand, because they've kind of mixed it out and they haven't gone really heavy into one aspect of the game, you might find they may not have enough tools to remove all of your flamethrowers or remove all of the submachine guns that are within your squad, at which point you might actually do okay and you might roll over them. So I think this one's kind of iffy. Gunline is, I think, one of the few choices, assuming, of course, that, the board is relatively medium in terms of its density. You might find this one is going to be really tough for you. Getting in and actually approaching the enemy is going to be really hard. They have a decent chance of removing quite a few of your threats before you end up getting in. And that means that they might just be able to stay back and sit back, right? Unless they absolutely have to cross the board. And even then, maybe they can cross it really quickly. So if they remove a bunch of your men early and then they can push up, even an objectives mission may not be bad for them. You just have to be really careful with this one, right? Because they're able to shoot at you before you're able to shoot at them. And when that's the case, you might suffer a lot of casualties before the lines even close. Horde armies are kind of iffy. It all depends. On the one hand, flamethrowers can be really good against hordes, especially if they don't have fanatics. On the other hand, if they have a lot of morale bubbles nearby, you might find that you literally just can't chew through all the bodies before they're done with you. And if that's the case, they might end up removing you just by sheer weight of dice. Mechanized armies are going to be really tricky, right? I mean, this is to some extent, it's a mirror strategy, right? Where they're moving up aggressively, typically in armored carriers. You're moving up aggressively in armored carriers. So it really all depends on how you maneuver, how they maneuver, and the kinds of threats you're going to see, right? Because if they can maneuver up toward the middle of the board, drop a bunch of machine guns, and shoot at you on the same turn and kind of winnow you down, even if you can reach them relatively quickly, you might not have the firepower to actually remove them. In which case, then you're nice and close. You're probably at point blank range. And then they hose you down with even more shots from machine guns, and that is going to hurt. Mortar heavy armies, you're actually pretty great, mostly because you're constantly on the move, so you're constantly resetting them. And a lot of them, I mean, it's only that 12-inch range, but a lot of them really would prefer to stay a good bit further back from you. So the closer you get to them, and especially now the fact that fixed weapons can't assault, means if you start getting really close and you start fighting them, it's not like they can even just close to close combat to try to remove you. They pretty much just have to run away. They don't have another option. They don't have pistols armed on their units. They have to get beyond 12. So eventually you get to the point where they're just running and you're just advancing and you're still hosing them down, if not with flamethrowers and at least with submachine guns. And you might find that you can have board control quite effectively against those kinds of armies. And then for skirmish armies, honestly, I think this is bad. In fact, I think this is actually the worst army you could fight because not only is it going to be hard to approach them since they've invested in long range shooting, these are guys who are designed to maneuver away from you as you start getting close and still continue hosing you down. And I think that could be really, really bad for you. And you can find that you're just stacking so many hits against yourself that eventually your squads become combat ineffective. So, what choices are you looking at? Your engineers, you can often take them regular. This is decent if all you're looking to do is clear an objective and then move on and have somebody else maintain it. If you take them veteran, you have the benefit that you can clear the objective and claim it and actually hold it because you are likely, assuming you have cover again, to actually stick around. Okay. You can take these inexperienced. I think they're way too fragile for the fact that you had to pay so many points to unlock a new platoon. So personally, I wouldn't, but technically for some armies, it's an option. Your flamethrower teams, you can take them regular. It's very good budget firepower for the 1 to 3 shots you're likely to get. You can take them veteran, which will do the exact same thing, except that they are slightly more resilient and more reliable. In previous editions, I really liked regular flamethrower teams. I've found in the 3 games I've played so far with engineering platoons, veteran flamethrower teams do live an awful lot longer. So I've been leaning a lot more toward those in recent past. For your anti-tank teams, okay, if you're going to be able to run this, it's going to be because it's nation specific. So, the Goliath Demolition Mine team is available to Germany. I'm going to be honest, as we mentioned in the Goliath video, this is relatively difficult to justify. They can be useful, but you're passing up on full engineer squads in order to take these. They're not replacing, say, like the flamethrower teams. So, I guess they're relatively cheap, but I don't personally think they're all that worth it. Okay. And then for your transports, I think half tracks and wheel vehicles are going to be the best way to do this. Again, you get the option for road movement in case there are roads. You also get access to, potentially in the case of the half track, a little bit better options for movement because you're not just stuck on open roads and roads. You can take tracked vehicles. The big benefit of tracked vehicles for moving up engineers is that they tend to be more durable. It's actually relatively hard to find a half-track vehicle that's above damage value 7. It's very difficult to find a wheeled armored transport that is above damage value 7. The benefit of tracked vehicles is you can have things that are damage value 8 or even 9 with a tracked vehicle. So it all depends. If you want it to stick around and you want to make sure that it's still around for, after dropping off the troops and maybe even continuing to provide heavy cover for them afterwards, it can be very, very helpful to have a tracked vehicle. But that's really the only reason why I would take one. So for nation considerations, what should you look at? First of all, obviously your mileage is going to vary because some nations just can't get flamethrowers. And so if you're looking at nations like Belgium, Denmark, Greece, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Slovakia, while they can technically take an engineer platoon, there's not a lot of reason to because it's just extra infantry that have to take the engineer keyword. So that's tricky. In the case of nations like Poland, cavalry don't get access to the engineer keyword, which, complete aside, would be a really useful rule for Poland because it would mean that you could assault people without them getting the benefit of defensive fortifications. But they can't. So toward that end, and as far as I can tell, that is historically accurate. I don't think there were any mounted regiments that were also engineer regiments. But the result is, for a lot of these nations, I think they're just going to pass just because why would they? Right? I mean, unless they were really planning on assaulting, and none of these armies can get good assault weapons to accompany the engineer special rule. Because they're like the Belgians, they get access to the Chasseurs Ardennais, which are tough fighters on everybody for +1 point, which is really nice. But the Chasseurs Ardennais can't take the engineer upgrade, so you can't combine those two things. Technically, the Greeks might be able to do it because you can take mountain troops with +1 point per man to take tough fighters, and you take engineers, so maybe you can combine those into like mountaineer engineers. But from experience, having played Greece quite a bit over the last few months in preparation for a tournament a couple months ago, I wouldn't. I just wouldn't. I don't think it's worthwhile. But suffice it to say, you're really no hard pressed to actually take engineers with any of these nations. Also, they can be a reasonable counter to low veterancy horde armies. So Your engineers will work really well against armies like Bulgaria, Norway, and the partisans who really don't have really good armor. And so what they're relying on infantry to do their job, and especially inexperienced and regular infantry. Norway, as of the PDF, this is not the same on the app, so it really would be nice from Warlord to give us some clarity on this. Cannot take extra men on the engineer squads, on their veteran Royal Guard squads, which means you're only running 5-man squads, and that's not very good for veterans, which means you'd be tempted to now be running regulars. Well, that's problematic if you run into engineers, because engineers hosing you down are likely to do quite a few wounds to you between submachine guns and flamethrowers, and then they're going to force a check. And even if you have a platoon commander nearby, your chances of passing are reasonable, but they aren't great. So it's just tricky. For armies like China and Japan, you might also see that they lean a little more into larger infantry hordes. It's a style and it's a way to play with Japan. I think we're likely to see them taking a lot more armor personally, and they've got relatively good artillery as well. So I think you're still going to see about 6 to 8 man squads, but you could see 10 to 15 man squads with Japan or China. So in those situations where they're probably running these guys and they might be running them a little more inexperienced and regular instead of veteran, you might find that you do pretty well with an engineer section. They're also good counter to regular armor armies. So anybody who is primarily locked into those damage value 7, 8, and possibly even 9 vehicles, nations like Belgium, Bulgaria, Greece, Japan, the partisans, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, since they are heavily locked into light armor, a flamethrower is actually a relatively good tool, not only because if they aren't going to be taking these veteran on account of you're not going to be ignoring too many pins anyway when you take these things veteran, a damage value 7, damage value 8 vehicle is very likely to be taking pins from you. They're reasonable to actually do damage to actually get to roll in the damage chart. And then they got to roll morale. And yes, while they might have a company or a platoon commander nearby, if you can catch them in a way where they don't, or if you can stack enough pins before the flamethrower goes in, you might still be able to pop these things and get rid of them. I think it requires a lot more setup than it did in second edition, which honestly I think is healthy for the game. And it's healthy for gaming communities in general, that you can't just walk up to somebody with a flamethrower, hose them down, and people start running. Because since not all armies get access to flamethrowers, it can kind of rub certain armies the wrong way. It's also a really good counter against multiple rocket launchers because you're going to be playing a very aggressive mobile force very early on into the fight. And so getting within that 36-inch minimum range is relatively easy. And since these tend to be taken inexperienced and regular, you might find that once you get to them, if you're hitting them with submachine guns or a flamethrower, if you don't remove the crew entirely, because they don't tend to have too many men and they tend to be taken relatively easy to wound, you might find that after the morale test between them firing and thus adding pins to themselves, and then you firing at them and adding pins to them, and then them having to take the morale check, even if they have a commander nearby, they might fail. So, on the whole, countering multiple rocket style Germany, Great Britain, Hungary, Soviet Union, the United States, you might find that actually works pretty well for you. So what changes would we recommend? It's not going to surprise anybody when I tell you that the engineering team, platoon, in my opinion, is bad. I think there's a reason why we're not seeing too many of them. They do need a help. You could do it by course correcting again on infantry flamethrowers, where, they started off probably too strong in second edition, pendulum swung the other way in third edition. You could try evening it out if you wanted to. I am not going to recommend a points reduction or removing some of the penalties. And the simple reason why I'm not going to touch a points reduction is because as soon as you do that, people trying to make armies using your modification strategy, your modification system in Easy Army or with the Warlord Games app, they can't do it anymore in those. Or they got to remember, oh, well, I actually have more points. So, when I'm looking at it, if it's 1,000-point match, I'm actually allowed to do 1,020 points because I'm taking 2 infantry flamethrowers or whatever. Like it's too messy. So I'm not going to recommend that. Okay. I think we should work with what we have. And honestly, toning down flamethrowers a bit is probably not the worst thing ever. I think I would lean into other things instead. So the first is you can improve the benefits of a special rule, like the engineer special rule. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the change that we made in the Zern mission pack that you will find available down in the description below. We'll take you to a download site where you can find it on our website. And so the change that we made to the engineering platoon is we just added an additional sentence so that when engineers who end their move in base contact with an abandoned artillery piece, which would include if you clear the unit out, right, in preparation for going in, or if you successfully assault a team weapon, then you can use that weapon for the remainder of the game. So if you are able to remove the entire squad around an artillery piece and then you run up, you can man an artillery piece. and you add it to whatever the engineer unit is doing. Now, you're not allowed to leave men behind and then move on and get an extra order dice. Your engineer platoon is going to be stuck there. Whatever unit is over there is going to be now manning it, but they can take advantage of enemy defensive pieces. If they overrun a machine gun team, a light, medium, or heavy mortar team, a sniper team, or an anti-tank team like a bazooka team or a Piat team, or you collect a couple of really nice dogs and you feed them bacon. Now the engineers can use that weapon. It still retains all of its rules. So if you take over a medium machine gun team, you can use the machine gun, but it does have the fixed property. Okay. And technically the squad now has the fixed property, so you won't be assaulting anything as long as you have the machine gun with you. Okay. So like there are questions, there are trade-offs to doing all of this stuff. You're going to need men to be able to man these things if you want to use them on a given turn. But if somebody's running a whole bunch of inexperienced light mortars, I can tell you now, engineers who got engineering training would totally know how to use a mortar. They're not particularly difficult to use. They're relatively simple pieces, and they've seen them used all around them on many occasions. And so because of that, you could end up with a team that's running a flamethrower. You could have a team with multiple flamethrowers that's not Gustatory Destruction Group. If you're able to assault, which is dangerous, an enemy flamethrower team, right? So toward that end, I think this on its own would give you an interesting reason to run engineers. And it would make it a very interesting challenge to people who are like, well, I'm going to run 5 bazooka teams, right? Or something like that. This would give you an interesting challenge to it. The next change that I would recommend is kind of leaning into emphasizing the defensive role that engineers had. Because yes, they were used for smoking people out with flamethrowers, yes. But they were also used, and this also true for nations that didn't have flamethrowers, for building defensive positions, which is why they're engineers. They were also used, by the way, for constructing bridges, but that's a completely separate thing. I don't feel like we should be like, feel free to bring 2 bridge markers with you and you can put down bridges over water terrain, though that might not be a bad idea. Okay. I would simply make that by taking an engineering platoon, the platoon itself gains 0 to 3 defensive fortifications. And the reason why I recommend this is, one, the engineering platoon is relatively light in terms of options. You get access to the officer, you get access to infantry, you get access to the flamethrower teams and transports for them. Even the heavy weapons platoon, which is also relatively limited, you're getting access to mortar slots, machine gun slots, anti-tank slots, in addition to your officer slots and your transport slots, right? It's bigger. Artillery getting all kinds of options between, field artillery and anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns and multiple rocket launchers potentially. In addition to some of those weird and wacky weapons that some nations get access to. So, like all of these other platoons are filling a lot of different roles. I mean, even the recce platoon that a lot of people take, you get infantry, you get anti-tank, you get forward observers. So you're getting at least 3 options in addition to your transports, which now get access to recce when you take them there, and your officer. Everybody's getting at least 5 options, except for engineers. Engineers only get access to 4, really. So I would give them access to the 5th. And the 5th that they get access to is defensive fortifications. So even if other people can't take them, you can start taking bunkers or gun pits or barbed wire or minefields or various things like that, which makes them very interesting and very different. And we have points costs as well as stats for all of those in the core rulebook. So anybody who owns the main rulebook has access to those as well. And I would give them one additional benefit within this context, which is I would allow them to take 1 free fortification, either barbed wire or dragon's teeth. So you can't take bunkers with this, okay? Or trenches with this, for every 100 points that you spend on the platoon. So if you're even just taking 2 infantry, even regular engineer sections with a flamethrower each, you don't take any submachine guns, you're not taking more than 2, you're not taking the flamethrower teams, you're already getting at least 1 free fortification, right? And if you're taking these things veteran with flamethrowers and your officer in order to run everything, you might already be up to 2. And then throw in a couple of more, and flamethrower teams. You throw in a couple more infantry sections. You bulk those out with a couple of extra guys or some machine guns. You could easily be sitting on 3 or 4 sets of barbed wire or dragon's teeth thrown in. And the reason why I think this would be very useful is that by taking an engineer platoon, you're probably cutting into the points you have available for armor. But losing armored vehicles is not so bad if you're making up for it with dragon's teeth. That would make it so that enemy vehicles are going to be blocked off from where they can maneuver. And so if you can pinpoint, okay, if the enemy wants to be able to move up and hit us, or if they want to maneuver away from us, they got to go in specific areas and specific places. Well, now you can plan for those with flamethrowers. And I think if that's the case, engineers now become reasonable for helping out with the anti-armor meta, without pumping up to the stratosphere the effectiveness of the flamethrower. And that leads us nicely into why does this matter? I think, first of all, because engineers were a thing, and so it would be nice to see them semi-regularly on the battlefield, maybe not as regularly as we saw them in second edition. So less frequent is fine, but I think they should still be on the table. And we've seen a lot of people looking at beautiful models that they spend a lot of time painting and saying, well, I guess I'm never using you again. And I feel like that's bad. Now, I was talking recently with a friend of mine who plays down in Australia, one of our wonderful subscribers to the channel, and he was mentioning that people do still use them. They use them a little more surgically, right? You have to be a little more careful than you did in second edition. And I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. I would just like to see it a little more appealing to more people. And who knows, maybe, I mean, again, the Aussies did really well at WTC, so maybe they know something we don't know. I don't know. Time will tell. We'll see. But at the very least, I think that they would provide another potential challenge to the armor meta that has heavily taken over. A lot of the best lists that you look at are running a lot of armored vehicles. And if we could bring flamethrowers back in as an opportunity for kind of giving at least some board control, if not some serious pause to armored vehicles, I think this could be a really, really good way to do it. Okay. It also provides a means of digging out entrenched enemies. Since Assault got a lot harder, getting a veteran 8-man paratrooper squad out of something is always going to be hard, right? Even with flamethrowers, that's going to be hard. But getting an 8-man veteran submachine gun, just regular veteran squad out could be a whole lot easier if you have a flamethrower, right? And so, my personal opinion, I would like to see these do something a little more so that it doesn't just become a get into the heavy cover, everybody hides, everybody just shoots at each other, and games get really boring. I want to avoid that. And I think flamethrowers could be one way to be able to do that because if nothing else, they do kind of force you to make decisions to counter them. And then finally, perhaps most pragmatically, it would sell more models. It will sell STL files for people, which means all parties benefit, right? Instead of whole sections of people's inventory becoming a ghost town, people are just not buying those models anymore, which kind of incentivizes people not to make anymore, which means we can easily end up with shortages from people who are making physical minis. I mean, I want to help these guys. I love the new sculpt work that Warlord Games is doing. I've loved buying Rubicon models. I've loved buying STLs from a wide variety of people. I try to rep a whole lot of those in my videos when I make them and where I think that it's pertinent. I want to see a rising tide raise all boats. And toward that end, I think one of the ways we can raise it is saying, hey, this part that used to be a good pipeline for you guys, that's probably seen a lot less sales over the last 6 to 9 months. Maybe we can help you guys out by bringing back flamethrowers as a sellable point for you all. So that way you guys can see a little more effectiveness in the work that you've been doing for the community. Because, and this is kind of where we'll end the video, like, I love this community. I love the game that we've created. I love the fact that, people who I've been playing with in Bolt Action have been among the kindest, among the most gentlemanly people I've ever played against. And people still get competitive because they want to win certain things. And fair enough. That's fine. So do I probably. So I can't really complain about that. But I do want to take care of the passionate creators who are out making models and who are making STL files for all of us. And I would just hate for them to pour in work to try to make a historically accurate flamethrower, which, as you can see, it's not so simple for some nations, right? This is not easy to do. And so I would love to see people be rewarded for the work that they're doing. And part of that, I think, means helping out the engineering platoon, because in my assessment, if I got to guess the over under on an engineering platoon over and against an armor platoon or an artillery platoon, I'm sorry, guys. I'm probably saying the engineering platoon is pretty bad. But am I wrong? Have you found that I am completely off on this, that they are more effective than I'm letting on? But if I'm off, please do let me know down below. If this does confirm what you're seeing down below, I mean, you can always share that as well, I guess, if you want to. But otherwise, please do leave your comments and feedback. I do appreciate reading them, and I do try to read every comment. But otherwise, we will see you next time.